But fix thy eyes upon the valley, for the river of blood draws nigh, in which boils everyone who by violence injures another. Canto number 7, Dante's Inferno. I've thought about it a lot, man, like why Victor and I made that terrible scene out there at San Quentin. Putting ourselves on that, it was just for kicks. Victor was hung up on kicks. They were a thing with him. He was a sharp, dark-haired cat, bright eyes, built lean and hard like a French skin diver. His dad dug only money, so he always had plenty of bread. We got the idea out of his pad on Praterero Hill, a penthouse, of course, one afternoon when we were lying around on the sun porch in swim trunks and drinking gin. You know, man, he said, I made just about every scene in the world. I bawled all the chicks, red, yellow, black, and white. I've got high on muggies, blue jays, red birds, mescaline. I even tried the white stuff a time or two. But, yeah, goddamn tiger, man, I interrupted. But there's one kick I've never had, man. When he didn't go on, I rolled my head off the quart gin bottle I was using for a pillow and looked at him. He was giving me a shot with those wild eyes of his. So, like, what is it? I've never watched an execution. I thought about it a minute, drowsily. The sun was so hot it was nailing me right into the air mattress. Watching an execution, seeing a man go through the wall. It was a groovy idea for an artist. Too much, I murmured. I'm with you, man. The next day, of course, I was back at work on some abstracts for my first one-man show and had forgotten all about it. But that night Victor called me up. Did you ride up to the warden up at San Quentin today, man? He has to contact the San Francisco police chief and make sure you don't have a record, you aren't a psycho, and you're useful to the community and all that. So I went ahead and wrote the letter, because even sober it still seemed like a cool idea for some kicks. I knew they always need 12 witnesses to make sure that the accused isn't sneaked out the back door or something last minute like an old Jimmy Cagney movie. Even so, I lay dead for 2 months before the letter came. The star of our show would be a stud who'd broken into the house trailer near Fort Ord to rape this army lieutenant's wife. Only right in the middle of it she started screaming, so he put a pillow over her face to keep her quiet. Only thing was, she quit breathing. I figure at least 8 out of the 12 jurors had gotten broken ankles in the rush to send him to the gas chamber. Not that I cared anyway. Kicks, man. Victor picked me up at 7:30 in the morning, an hour before we were supposed to report to San Quentin. He was wearing this really hip Italian import, $50 shoes, and narrow brim hat with a little feather in it. All he needed was a briefcase to be chairman of the board. The top was down on the Mercedes, cold as it was, and when he saw my black suit and hand-knit tie, he flashed me a crazy white-toothed grin you'd never see in any director's meeting. Too much, killer. If you'd like comb your hair, you could pass for the undertaker coming after the body. Since I am a very thin cat with black hair always hanging in my eyes, who, fully dressed, weighs about as much as a medium-sized collie, I guess he wasn't too far off. I put a pint of Jose Cuervo in the side pocket of the car, and we split. We were both really turned on. I mean, the senseless, breathless hilarity, as if we just heard the world's funniest joke, or were going to soon. It was one of those chilly California brights, with blue sky, cold sunshine here and there. A cloud like Mr. Big was popping himself a cap down beyond the horizon. I dug it all. The sail of an early lone yacht out in the bay like a tossed-away paper cup, the white caps flipping around out by Angel Island like they were stoned out of their minds, the top down on a 300 SL so we could smell salt and feel the icy bite of the wind. But beyond the tunnel of US 101 coming down Marin City, I felt a sudden sharp chill as if the cloud had passed between me and the sun. But none had, and then I dug for the first time what was actually happening. Victor felt it too. He must have, for he turned to me and said, "Must maintain cool, Dad." I'm with it, I said. San Quentin prison, out at the end of the peninsula, looked like a sprawled, ugly dragon sunning himself on a rock. We pulled up near the east gate, and there were not even any birds out singing, just a bunch of quiet cats in black. Quakers or Mennonites or something, protesting capital punishment by their silent presence, as if they'd done ever since Chessman had gotten his out there. I felt dark, frightening things moving around inside me when I saw them. "Let's fall out right here, man," I said, in a momentary sort of panic, "and catch the matinee next week." But Victor was in Kicksville, like desperate to put all those squares in the black suits in their place. When they looked over at us, he jumped up on the back of the bucket seat and spread his arms wide, like the Sermon on the Mount. With his tortoise-shell shades and his flashing teeth and that suit which cost $3, he looked like Christ on his way to Hollywood. "Whosoever ye do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me," he cried in this ringing apocalyptic voice. I grabbed his arm and dragged him down off the top of his seat. "For Christ's sakes, man, cool it." But he went into high laughter and punched my arm with feverish exuberance, and then jerked a tiny American flag from the inside of his jacket pocket and began waving it around above the windshield. I could see the sweat on his forehead. "It's worth it to live in this country," he yelled at them. He put the car in gear and he went on. I looked back and saw one of those cats crossing himself. It put things back in perspective. They were from nowhere, the Middle Ages. Not that I judged them. That was their scene, man. Unto every cat what he digs the most. The guard on the gate directed us to a small wooden building set against the outside wall, where we found 5 other witnesses. 3 of them were reporters. One was a cat smoking a .45 caliber stogie like a politician from Sacramento. And the last was an army type in lieutenant's bars, his belt buckle and insignia looking as if he'd been up all night with a can of Brasso. A guard came in and told us to surrender everything in our pockets, and we got a receipt for it. He had us remove our shoes, too. They were too heavy for the fluoroscope. Then they put us through this groovy little room one by one to x-ray us for cameras and so on. They didn't want anyone making a Kodak moment while they were dropping the pellets. We ended up inside the prison with our shoes back on and with our noses full of that old prison detergent disinfectant stink. The politician type, who had these cold eyes like a Sherman tank, started coming on with rank jokes, but everyone put him down hard, even the reporters. I guess nobody but Fuzz ever gets used to executions. The army stud was at parade rest with a face so pale his freckles looked like a charger shot. He had reddish hair. After a while, 5 guards came in to make up the 12 required witnesses. They all looked ranked, as Fuzz often does, and got off in the corner in a little huddle, laughing and gasping together like they were a bunch of kids kicking a dog. Victor and I sidled over to hear what they were saying. "Who's sniffing the eggs this morning?" asked one. "I don't know. I haven't been reading the papers," he yawned when the other answered. "Don't you remember?" urged the other. "It's the guy who smothered the woman in the house trailer, down in the valley by Salinas. Yeah, soldier's wife. He was raping her and..." Like dogs hearing the plate rattle, they turned in unison toward the army lieutenant. But then more Fuzz came in to march us to the observation room. We went in a column of 2s with guards beside each one, everyone unconsciously in step as if following a cadence call. I caught myself listening for the measured and mournful drum rolls. The observation room was built right around the gas chamber, with rising tiers of benches for extras in case business was brisk. The chamber itself was hexagonal. The 3 walls in our rooms were of plate glass with waist-high brass rail around the outside, like the rail in an old-timey saloon. The other three walls were steel plate, with a heavy door, rivet-studded, in the center one, and a small observation window on each of the others. Inside the chamber were just these two massive chairs, possibly oak, facing the rear wall side by side. Their backs were high enough to come up to the neck of anyone sitting in them. Under each one was like a bucket that I knew contained hydrochloric acid. At a signal, the executioner would drop sodium cyanide pellets into a chute. The pellets would roll down into the bucket, and hydrocyanic acid gas would form, and the cat in the chair, he'd be wasted. The politician type, who had this rich, fruity baritone like Burl Ives, asked why they had two chairs. "That's in case there's a double-header, man," I said. "You're kidding." But by his voice I could tell the idea pleased him. Then he wheezed plaintively, "I don't see why they turn the chairs away. We can't even watch his face while it's happening to him." He was a true, rank, genuine creep, right out from under a rock with slime barely dry on his scales. I wouldn't have wanted to have his dreams. I think he was one of those guys who taste the big drought many times before they actually swallow it. We milled around like cattle around the chute when they smell of blood from inside and know they're somehow involved. Then we heard sounds and saw the door in the back of the chamber swing open. A uniformed guard appeared to stand at attention, followed by a priest dressed all in black like Zorro, with his face hanging down to his belly button. He must have been a new man, because he was having trouble maintaining his cool. Just standing there beside the guard, he dropped his little black book on the floor like 3 times in a row. The army cat said to me, as if he'd wig out unless he broke the silence, "They have it arranged like a stage play, don't they?" "But no encores," said Victor hollowly. Another guard showed up in the doorway, and they walked in with the condemned man. He was like short of a shock. You expect a stud to act like a murderer. I mean, cringe at the sight of the chair because he knows that this is it. There's finally no place to go, no appeal to make, or else bound in there full of cheap bravado or a go-to-hell attitude. But he just seemed mildly interested, nothing more. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, suntans that looked army issue, and no tie. Under 30, brown crew-cut hair. The terrible thing is, I can't even remember the features of his face, man. The closest I would come to a description would be to say that he resembled the army cat right beside me, with his nose to the glass. The one thing that I'll never forget is the stud's hands. He'd been on death row all these months, and here his hands were still red and chapped and knobby, as if he'd been out picking turnips in San Joaquin Valley. Then I realized it. I was thinking of him in the past tense. 2 of the fuzzers began strapping him down in the chair, a broad leather strap across the chest, and narrower belts across the arms and legs. God, they were careful about strapping him in. I mean, they wanted to make sure he was comfortable. And all the time he was talking with them. Not that we could hear it, but I suppose it went something like, "That's fine, fellas. No, that strap isn't too tight. Gee, I hope I'm not making you late for lunch." That's what bugged me. He was so damned apologetic. While they were fastening him down over this little bucket of oblivion, that poor dead lonely son of a bitch twisted around to look over his shoulder at us. And he smiled. I mean, if he'd had an arm free, he might have even waved. One of the fuzz, who'd had white hair and those sad, gentle eyes, like he was wearing a hair shirt, patted him on the head on the way out. "Nothing personal, son, just doing my job." After that, the tempo increased, like your heartbeat when you're on a dark street at 3 a.m., and the echo of your own footsteps begins to sound like someone following you. The warden was at one observation window, the priest and the doctor at the other. The black-robed dude made the sign of the cross, having the last go at the condemned, but he was digging only Ben Casey. Here was this MD cat who had taken the Hippocratic Oath to preserve life, waving his arms around like a TV director to show the stud the easiest way to die. Hold your breath, then breathe deeply. You won't feel a thing. Of course, hydrocyanuric acid gas melts your guts into a red-hot soup and burns out every fiber in the lining of your lungs, but you won't be really feeling it as you jerk around. That'll just be raw nerve endings. Like, they should have called his the hypocritical oath. So there we were, 3 yards and a half an inch of plate glass apart, with us staring at him and him just turning his head able to stare right back. But there were a million light years between the two sides of the glass. He didn't turn. He was shrived and strapped in, and now briefed on how to die. He was ready for the fumes. I found out afterwards that he had even willed his body to medical research. I did a quick take-around. Victor was sweating profusely, his eyes glued to the window. The politician was bug-eyed, nose pressed flat and belly indented on the brass rail, pudgy fingers like plump garlic sausage smearing the glass on either side of his head. A look on his face already, like that of a stud making it with a chick. The reporters seemed kind of ashamed, as if someone had just caught them peeking over the transom in the ladies' john. The army cat just looked sick. Only the fuzz were unchanged, expending no more emotion on this than on their targets after rapid-fire exercises at the range. On no face was there hatred. Suddenly, for the first time in my life, I realized I was a part of it. I wanted to yell out, "Stop!" We were about to gas the stud, and none of us really wanted him to die. We created this society, and we're all responsible for what it does, but none of us as individuals are willing to take responsibility. We're like that Nazi cat at Nuremberg who said that everything would have been all right if they'd only given him more ovens. The warden signaled. I heard gas whoosh up around the chamber. The condemned man didn't move. He was following the doctor's orders. Then he took huge gulping breaths as the MD had pantomimed. All of a sudden, he threw this tremulous convulsion. His body strained up against the straps. His head slewed around, so I could see his eyes were tight shut, and his lips were pulled back from his teeth. Then he started panting like a baby in an oxygen tent, slowly and shallowly. Only it wasn't oxygen his lungs were trying to work on. The lieutenant stepped back from the glass smartly, blinked, and then puked everywhere. His vomit hung on the glass a bit for a second, like a phosphorus bomb burst in a bunker. Then 2 fuzz were supporting him from the room, and we were all jerking back from the mess. I'll accept the politician. He hadn't even noticed. He was in Henry Millerville, getting his sex kicks the easy way. I guess the stud in there had never dug that he was supposed to be gone in 2 seconds without pain, because his body was still arched up in that terrible bow. His heads were still claws. I could see the muscles staring out along the sides of his jaws like marbles. Finally, he flopped back and just hung there in the straps like a machine gun paratrooper. But that wasn't the end. He took another huge gasp, so I could see his ribs pressing out against his white shirt. After that, 20 seconds, and we finally decided he'd cut out. Then another gasp, and then nothing. Half a minute, and still nothing. Another of those final terrible shuddering raking gasps, and at last all through. All used up, making it with the angels, or devils. But then he did it again. Every fiber of that dead, wasted, comic, thrown-away body strained for air on this one. No air, only hydrocyanuric acid gas. Just nerves, like the fish twitching after you whack it on the skull with the back edge of a skinning knife. Except that this wasn't a fish we were seeing die. His head flopped sideways and his tongue came out slyly like the tongue of a dead deer. Then this gunk ran out of his mouth. It was just saliva. They said it couldn't be anything else, but it reminded me of the residue after a light line resistor has been melted in electrical fire. That kind of black, that kind of scorched. Very softly, almost to himself, Victor murmured, "Later, man." That was it. Dig you in the hereafter, man. 10 little minutes, and you're through the wall. Mr. Kurtz, he dead. Mr. Kurtz, he very goddamn dead. I believed it. Looking at what was left of that cat was like looking at a chick who's gotten herself bombed on the heavy. So when you hold a match in front of her eyes, the pupils don't react. No one's home, man. Nowhere. End of the Lineville. We split. But on the way out, I kept thinking of that army stud and wondered what had made him sick. Was it because the cat in the chair had been the last one to come in contact with, no matter how violently, the body of his beloved, and even now that febrile connection had been severed? Whatever the reason, his body had known what perhaps his mind had refused to accept. This ending was no new beginning. This death would not restore his dead chick to him. This death, no matter how just in his eyes, had only generated nausea. Victor and I sat in the Mercedes for a long time with the top down, looking out of that bright, beautiful, empty peninsula, not named, as you might think, after a saint, but after some poor dumb Indian they'd hung there a few 100 years before or so. Trees and clouds and blue water, still no birds making the scene. Even the cats in the black suits had vanished. But now I understood why they'd been there. In their silent censure, they had been sounding the right gong, man. We're the ones from the Middle Ages. Victor took a deep, shuddering breath as if he could never get enough air. Then he said in a barely audible voice, "How did you dig that action, man?" I gave a little shrug, and being myself, said the only thing I could. "It was a gas, man." "I dig, man. I'm hip. A gas." Something was wrong with the way he said it, though, but I broke the seal on the tequila, and we killed it in 15 minutes, without even a lime to suck on in between. Then he started the car, and we cut out, and I realized what was wrong. Watching that cat in the gas chamber, Victor had realized for the very first time that life is far more than just kicks. We were both partially responsible for what happened in there, and we both had ineluctably diminished by it. On US 101, he coked the Mercedes up to 105 miles per hour through traffic and held it there. It was wild in the end, but I didn't sound. I was alone without my guide by the boiling river of blood. When the highway patrol finally got us stopped, Victor was coming on so strong and I was coming on so mild that they surrounded us with their holster flaps unbuckled and checked our veins for needle marks. I didn't say a word to him, man, not one, not even my name, like they had to look in my wallet to see who I was. And while they were doing that, Victor blew his cool entirely. You know, biting, foaming at the mouth, the whole bit. He gave a very good show until they hit him on the back of the head with a sap. I just watched, not saying a word. They lifted his license for a year, nothing else, because his old man spent a lot of bread on a shrinker who testified that Victor had temporarily wigged out and who had him put away in the zoo for a time. He's back now, but he still sees that wig picker 3 times a week at 40 clams a shot. He needs it. A few days ago, I saw him on the Upper Grant, stalking lithely through the gray, raw February day with a fog in, wearing just a t-shirt and jeans, no shoes. He seemed agitated, pressed, confined within his own thoughts, but I stopped him for a minute. "Hey, how you making it, man? What's the gig?" He shook his head cautiously. "They'll not let us get away with it, you know. Like to them, man, just living is a crime." "Why no strollers, man?" "I can't wear shoes." He moved closer and glanced up and down the street with a tragic earnestness. "I can only hear with the soles of my feet, man." Then he nodded and padded away through the crowds of silent, naked souls like a puzzled panther, drifting through the fruiters and drunken teenagers and fuzz trying to bust some cats for possession who have inherited North Beach from the true swingers. I guess all Victor wants to listen to now is Mother Earth. All he wants to hear is the comforting sound of the worms chewing away and waiting for Victor, waiting for me, maybe waiting for the second coming.